Okay, so these are toss-ups over authors and works, the part of my study guide that is the section of Gunter Grass through Neil Simon. There are 46 toss-ups, and so I'm going to get through them as fast as I can. Let's go ahead and start with number 1. In this novel, Crazy Leo appears at every funeral in a certain city, and Mr. Shmoo discovers a jazz band. One character in this novel earns the nickname Jesus after vandalizing a chocolate factory and making a key decision due to the idea that he might have to be a grocer. Roswitha dies in this novel, in which patrons cry at the onion seller. After finding a bloody ring finger, the protagonist of this novel is accused of killing Sister Dorothea. That protagonist of this first work of the Danzig trilogy can shatter glass with his voice and stops growing at age 3. For 10 points, name this novel about Oscar Matzerath, a work by Gunter Grass. And that is the Tin Drum. Toss-up 2. One novel by this author centers on Felix, a theater director exiled to a prison while trying to get revenge on his former assistant Tony. In another novel by this author, the protagonist works in the Rejuve compound while helping to advertise Bliss Plus pills as an age-reverting drug. This author retold Shakespeare's The Tempest in the novel Hagseed. The protagonist, Jimmy, plays the trivia game Extinctathon and takes the name Snowman in this author's post-apocalyptic novel Oryx and Crake. This author wrote about angels and guardians surveilling the rebels in a novel set in Gilead. For 10 points, name this Canadian author who wrote about Offred in her novel The Handmaid's Tale. That is Margaret Atwood. Toss-up 3. Over Thanksgiving dinner, this novel's protagonist attacks the idea of a god who would include phlegm and tooth decay in his creation. In this novel, a businessman disguises his one-man company by adding an ampersand to its name. In this novel, a Henry Fonda lookalike jumps out of a windows to avoid talking to the other officers. Everybody has a share and a scheme in this novel that buys eggs in Malta for 7 cents and sells them in mess halls for 5. Its protagonist wants to be discharged for insanity, but has to keep flying missions due to the title paradox. Milo Minderbender, Major, and Yossarian star in, for 10 points, what satirical war novel by Joseph Heller? And that is Catch-22. Toss-up number 4. In a novel by this author, a midwife named Madeir heals Aunt Jimmy's illness, only for her to die after eating some peach cobbler. In that novel by this author, Velma's departure is compared to the way people leave a hotel room in a letter to God written by Soaphead Church. Amy helps the protagonist of a novel by this author give birth on a river, and she is later ferried across that river by stamp paid. The McTeer sisters befriend Piccola Breedlove in a novel by this author. A novel by this author begins with Paul D's arrival at 124 Bluestone Road. For 10 points, name this author of The Bluest Eye, who wrote about Sethe and the daughter she killed in Beloved. And that is Toni Morrison. Toss-up 5. A character in this novel gives birth to a son in a convent and sends the baby floating down a river in a basket. 2 indistinguishable twins in this novel are buried in each other's coffins. A flood that lasts for 5 years begins the day after a massacre in this book. A long, undeciphered prophecy in this novel predicts a boy will be devoured by ants. A successful colonel in this book has 17 children, all with the same name, all of whom are assassinated. Many characters in this novel have variants of the name Jose Arcadio. This novel, set in Macondo, describes 7 generations of the Buendia family. For 10 points, name this novel by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And that is 100 Years of Solitude. Toss-up 6. One novel by this man tells the story of Colin Fenwick, an orphan who moves in with his aunts, Dolly and Verena, while another tells the story of Joel Knox, a 13-year-old boy dealing with the death of his mother. In addition to writing The Grass Harp and Other Voices, Other Rooms, this author traveled to Holcomb, Kansas to investigate the murder of Herb Clutter, his wife and children, which he turned into a best-selling nonfiction novel. Another novella profiled a Manhattan socialite, Holly Golightly. For 10 points, identify this author of In Cold Blood and Breakfast at Tiffany's. And that is Truman Capote. Toss-up number 7. At one point in this book, the protagonist's father arrives and takes her and her brother to St. Louis, where they are reunited with their mother. The narrator of this work describes her harrowing abuse and rape by Mr. Freeman, who is murdered after being acquitted. One sympathetic figure is Bertha Flowers, who gives the protagonist books and later attends George Washington High School. That character becomes the first black female streetcar driver after she moves to San Francisco to escape the racist indignities of living in Stamps, Arkansas. For 10 points, name this autobiographical work by Maya Angelou. And that is I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. Toss-up 8. This author wrote a work in which Henry Morley climbs Matterhorn Peak after J.P. Ryder introduces Ray Smith to Yab Yum rituals. A cabin on Bixby Canyon is owned by Lorenzo Monsanto is the setting of another of his works in which Cody Pomeroy's mistress Billy lives with the narrator Jack Duluos. His best-known novel sees the narrator stay in New Orleans with Old Bull Lee after hitchhiking to Denver to meet up with Carlo Marx and Dean Moriarty. For 10 points, name this author of The Dharma Bums and Big Sur, who fictionalized himself as Sal Paradise in On the Road. And that is Jack Kerouac. Toss-up 9. One character in this novel learns that she is an aunt to 2 adopted children after Corinne falls ill. Another character chooses to undergo ritual scarification out of empathy for the female circumcision ritual suffered by the woman he loves, Tashi. One woman in this novel is sentenced to work for a mayor for 12 years after initially refusing by saying, hell no. That woman, Sophia, later remarries Harpo. The main character of this novel learns that Mr. has hidden letters written by Nettie. Later, that woman opens a pants shop with Shug Avery. For 10 points, name this novel about Seeley, written by Alice Walker. And that is The Color Purple. Toss-up 10. Etheridge Knight's poem, The Sun Came, responds to a poem by this author that ponders the question, and if the sun comes, how shall we greet him? This author included Truth in the Womanhood section of a collection whose second section adapts Chaucer's Rhyme Royal for a 43-stanza mock epic titled The Aeneid. A poem by this author describes the tobacco crumbs, vases, and fringes of a rented back room where dinner is a casual affair for Old Yellow Pair, who are mostly good. This author repeated a pronoun at the end of each line of a poem that uses single-syllable words to depict 7 at the Golden Shovel, who left school, lurk late, and strike straight. For 10 points, name this African-American poet of The Bean Eaters and We Real Cool. And that is Gwendolyn Brooks. Toss-up 11. In this novel, the main character and her brother are taken to First Purchase Church by Calpurnia, who is treated rudely when Aunt Alexandra decides to stay at the main character's house for a while. The main character's father shoots a bad dog. That event occurs after the father controversially takes the case of Tom Robinson, a black man accused of raping Mayella Ewell. Go Set a Watchman is the sequel to this novel, often considered a Bildungsroman about the daughter of Atticus Finch. For 10 points, name this novel about Scout, written by Harper Lee. And that is To Kill a Mockingbird. Toss-up 12. This playwright wrote a play that takes place in an apartment above Kernit's candy store, where Eddie's mother takes care of his sister Bella and his sons Artie and Jay. This writer also completed a trilogy about Eugene Jerome, a New Yorker who goes through basic training in Mississippi near the end of World War II before trying to become a comedy writer. Another one of this writer's works is about a divorced news writer named Felix Unger, who moves in with sports writer Oscar Madison. The trilogy consists of Broadway Bound, Biloxi Blues, and Brighton Beach Memoirs. For 10 points, name this writer of Lost in Yonkers and The Odd Couple. And that is Neil Simon. Toss-up number 13. Eugenia Ginsberg's experience in these places informed her memoir, Journey into the Whirlwind. A work about these places compares their inhabitants to players of a game of Grand Solitaire who do not know its rules. At the end of a novel set in one of these places, the narrator notes that 3,653 days that he has lived have not been described to the reader. In that novel, a character who lives in one of these places owns a spoon he casts from aluminum wire. A group of Zeks living in one of these places comprise Gang 104 in a novel set in one of them. That novel was circulated as samizdat literature. For 10 points, the novella, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, is set in what sort of place, which also titles an archipelago described by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And that is a gulag. Toss-up 14. This man's first novel is partly set on Calf Island and centers on the 777-year-old flapping eagle who seeks mortality. An alias created by this man that combines the first names of Conrad and Chekhov titles a 2014 memoir. This author of Grimus and Joseph Anton wrote a novel about 1,001 babies born in the hour following a certain country's 1947 independence. Another of his books begins with the bombing of a plane and includes the passengers Saladin Chamcha and Jibril Farishta. That book by this author resulted in the Ayatollah Khomeini issuing a fatwa against him. For 10 points, name this Indian-born author of Midnight's Children and the Satanic Verses. And that is Salman Rushdie. Toss-up 15. The neighbor of the protagonist of this novel is a Catholic mother of 6 children named Dodo Conway. The protagonist assumes the identity of an orphan named Ellie Higginbottom to flirt with a sailor, and she is repulsed more by the advances of Joan than by the Peruvian Marco's attempt to date rape her. Its protagonist seduces the math professor Irwin, but breaks up with her boyfriend, Buddy Willard. This novel contains an episode of food poisoning suffered by Betsy and Doreen, who are working for a New York fashion magazine. It opens with the execution of the Rosenbergs and centers on Esther Greenwood. For 10 points, name this novel by Sylvia Plath. And that is The Bell Jar. Toss-up 16. This author wrote 2 responses to Beckett's Waiting for Godot, the post-apocalyptic What Use Are Flowers, and the parodic The Arrival of Mr. Toadog. Gloria commits suicide after being dumped by Alton Scales in a play by this author, whose title character, a Greenwich Village writer, becomes disillusioned by the corrupt politician Wally O'Hara. One of this author's characters drunkenly imagines stabbing people with a flaming spear, while another shouts, "Oh, Kamogosie." The protagonist debates whether to accept an offer from Carl Linder in a play by this author in which George Murchison and Joseph Assagai both court Beneatha. For 10 points, name this author of The Sign in Sidney Brustein's Window, who wrote about the deferred dreams of the Younger family in A Raisin in the Sun. And that is Lorraine Hansberry. Toss-up 17. This author claimed, "I'd wash my dirty Iran if he were doing his laundry," in the poem Homework. This author recorded one of his poems while on a Greyhound bus and set another on a tin can banana dock. Those are his Wichita Vortex Sutra and Sunflower Sutra. This author addressed Garcia Lorca and Walt Whitman in a poem, A Supermarket in California, and he dedicated a poem to the death of his mother, Naomi, in Kaddish. This author's most famous poem opens, "I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness." For 10 points, name this beat poet, the author of Howl. And that is Allen Ginsberg. Toss-up 18. In this novel, the janitor, Burma Jones, writes the name of his cruel employer's nightclub on the back of the pornographic photos she sells, leading to her arrest. The protagonist of this novel works with the elderly Miss Trixie before he is fired for attempting to lead a factory strike. This work's protagonist also fails in his work as a hot dog salesman because he eats more than he sells. When his mother wishes to commit him to an asylum, the Dr. Nut Soda and Boethius-loving protagonist of this novel is rescued by his girlfriend, Myrna Minkoff. For 10 points, name this novel by John Kennedy Toole about Ignatius J. Riley. And that is A Confederacy of Dunces. Toss-up 19. This author's idea that language is a virus was first elucidated in his novel, The Ticket That Exploded, the second book in a trilogy which also includes The Soft Machine and The Nova Express. Those novels used the cut-up method and developed along with Brion Gysin while living in the so-called Beat Hotel in Paris. His first novel was a thinly fictionalized account of his own heroin addiction, Junkie, written a few years after he accidentally killed his wife while drunkenly attempting to shoot a glass off of her head. His magnum opus is a collection of routines involving characters like the liquefactionist Hassan and the malevolent Dr. Benway. For 10 points, who is this Beat Generation author of Naked Lunch? And that is William Burroughs. Toss-up 20. Chapter 15 of this novel largely centers on a dinner party attended by guests called Lemon Tarts and Social X-Rays, and who listen to a speech on Poe's The Mask of the Red Death, delivered by a gay poet, Aubrey Buffing. A woman in this novel flees to Italy to escape public life and later marries the painter Filippo Schirazzi. Honest Abe Weiss pursues the great white defendant in this novel, which concludes with a fictional newspaper article reporting the journalist Peter Fallow won a Pulitzer Prize for his articles about the hit-and-run death of the black youth Henry Lamb. The bonds trader Sherman McCoy is charged with vehicular manslaughter in, for 10 points, what's satire by Tom Wolfe, which is titled For a Type of Conflagration. And that is Bonfire of the Vanities. Toss-up 21. This author was a part of Group 47 and wrote a novel in which Simon Doc hosts a meeting of intellectuals. In another of his novels, Tula gives birth to Paul while escaping a sinking ship. This author of The Meeting at Telget and Crabwalk also featured Tulla in a novel where Edward Amsel collects various SA uniforms to dress his scarecrows in. After he is told he is to be a grocer, one of this author's characters resolves never to grow up and is given a certain instrument on his 3rd birthday. Dog Years and Cat and Mouse are among the works included in this author's Danzig trilogy. For 10 points, name this author of The Tin Drum, who died in April of 2015. And that is Günter Grass. Toss-up 22. One character in this novel remembers a garden with the smell of turned earth, the plump shapes of bulbs, as a symbol of motherhood, and sits on a pillow embroidered with faith. One character in this novel leaves the red center by attacking Aunt Elizabeth. Notley Wade appears in the epilogue of this novel, explaining tapes with Professor Piexoto. The protagonist of this novel learns the code word Mayday from Moira, and is forced to work for the husband of Serena Joy, the commander in the Republic of Gilead. For 10 points, name this novel about Offred, a dystopian novel by Margaret Atwood. And that is The Handmaid's Tale. Toss-up 23. This author chronicled the succession of owners of Rembrandt's Aristotle contemplating the bust of Homer in the novel Picture This. King Solomon is nicknamed Shlomo and derives all of his wisdom from clay tablets in his retelling of the David story, God Knows. In one of his works, Bruce Gold becomes Secretary of State and sees Bob Slocum accidentally smother his injured son. In addition to Good as Gold and Something Happened, another of his novels is set on Pianosa and features the character of Colonel Cathcart and Milo Minderbender. For 10 points, identify this author who wrote about Major and Yossarian in Catch-22. And that is Joseph Heller. Toss-up number 24. One character in this work is cared for by a medicine woman known as Mdir and dials while eating peach cobbler. Aside from Auntie Jimmy, the other characters in this work include the prostitutes Maginot Line, China, and Poland. In this work, Claudia and Frida sacrifice money that we're saving for a bicycle in order to plant marigold seeds in the hope that an unborn child will not die if they bloom. Most of this work's chapters are titled after passages from Dick and Jane. The protagonist of this work is raped by her father, Charlie, which causes her to believe that she has acquired a long-sought-after quality. Piccola Breedlove desires to be white and possess the titular feature in, for 10 points, what novel by Toni Morrison? And that is The Bluest Eye. Toss-up number 25. A story by this author features a tarantula with a girl's face who is only fed meatballs. The title character of that story is imprisoned in a chicken coop but flies away at the end. This author also wrote a novel in which Urbino dies while trying to get a parrot out of a tree, allowing Florentino Ariza and Fermina Daza to reunite. Another novel by this author of a very old man with enormous wings includes the gypsy Melquiades and a man who has 17 sons, all named Aureliano, in the town of Macondo. For 10 points, name this author who wrote about the Buendia family in 100 Years of Solitude. That is Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Toss-up number 26. One character in this novel divorces his third wife because she began a revolt on his yacht. Madame Sofia Spinella circulates a petition to evict one character in this novel. That character buys this novel's narrator a birdcage and changes her name from Lulame. In this novel, Mag Wildwood marries the gay millionaire Rusty Trawler. Another character in this novel abandons her much older husband Doc to pursue an acting career, during which she makes money transmitting messages to Sally Tomato in prison before escaping to Brazil to avoid indictment. For 10 points, name this novel about Holly Golightly, written by Truman Capote. And that would be Breakfast at Tiffany's. Toss-up 27. In one work, this author wrote, "To describe my mother would be to write about a hurricane in its perfect power." In a work by this author, Henry Reed delivers the valedictorian speech, "To be or not to be," before singing, "Lift every voice and sing." This author's time as a university administrator in Ghana is related in the book, All God's Children Need Traveling Shoes. This author described moving in with Daddy Clydell and Vivian Baxter Johnson prior to conducting a San Francisco streetcar and becoming pregnant in high school. This author read her poem, On the Pulse of Morning, at Bill Clinton's inauguration. She described going mute after being raped by Mr. Freeman at the age of 8 in a memoir titled for a line from Paul Laurence Dunbar's poem, Sympathy, and mostly is set in Stamps, Arkansas. For 10 points, what African-American poet wrote the autobiography, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings? And that is Maya Angelou. Toss-up number 28. In this novel, the meaning of tomorrow is told to the protagonist by Ricky. In a part of this novel, the main characters see a performance by the blind jazz pianist George Shearing. Remy Buncourt arrives for the protagonist of this novel to get a job as a night watchman. The main character of this novel is nicknamed the Holy Goof. This novel is written on a giant scroll over a 3-week period, and its character of Carlo Marx represents Allen Ginsberg. For 10 points, name this novel by Jack Kerouac, featuring Sal Paradise and Dean Moriarty. and that is On the Road. Toss-up number 29. In one of this author's stories, a mother prevents her daughter Dee from taking the family quilts from her younger sister Maggie. That work is Everyday Use. This author wrote about Tashi, who murders the female circumciser, Melissa, and in another work, Brownfeld has an affair at the Dewdrop Inn with his father's lover, Josie. In addition to possessing Secret Joy and The Third Life of a Grand Copeland, in another work, Corinne and Reverend Samuel take in Nettie, while the protagonist is forced into abusive marriage with Mr. Blank before having a relationship with Shug Avery. For 10 points, name this author who wrote about Celie in The Color Purple. And that would be Alice Walker. Toss-up number 30. Each of the 8 sentences of this 8-line poem are 3-word independent clause, and all but the last ending with the same 2-letter pronoun. The poem's epigraph refers to a pool hall, the name of which could be a metaphor for the life of pleasure that leads to death, the main theme. The poem's central pronoun refers to the 7 at the Golden Shovel who lurk late and strike straight. Written by the author of Annie Allen, the first black woman to win a Pulitzer, for 10 points, what deceptively simple poem central figures Jazz June and Die Soon in a work by Gwendolyn Brooks. And that is We Real Cool. Toss-up 31. In one of this author's novels, a girl nearly kills herself after believing she has become pregnant by kissing a boy. Uncle Jack advises a character created by this author after she finds a copy of The Black Plague and discovers that her father and many other members of Maycomb County are racists. The discovery of a draft in a safety deposit box in 2014 led to the publication of this author's Go Set a Watchman, a sequel to a novel centering on the trial of Tom Robinson and his defense by the young scout's father. For 10 points, name this author who created Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird. That is Harper Lee. Toss-up 32. Imagery in this poem include a ghastly statue with one gray toe and a cleft in your chin instead of your foot. The speaker of this poem thinks, I may well be a Jew, and remembers barely daring to breathe or chew. This poem mentions a vampire who drank the speaker's blood for 7 years, a reference to this author's marriage to Ted Hughes. This poem opens, You do not do, and describes a man in black with a Mein Kampf look. The speaker of this poem tells the title figure, You bastard, I'm through, after comparing him to a Nazi. For 10 points, name this poem by Sylvia Plath. And that is the poem Daddy. Toss-up 33. Ralph Parker was the first to translate any of this author's works into English. Another of his works is a cycle of 4 books he called Knots, the last 2 of which remain untranslated into English, as do his memoir, The Little Grain Managed to Land Between Two Millstones, and his controversial history of Jews in his country 200 years together. In another historical work, he described the Kingir uprising and examined the course of life of a typical Zek. After overhearing a conversation about Einstein's Ivan the Terrible, the protagonist of a novella by this man agrees to wait in line for Caesar, who receives food packages from his family and listens to a story told by Tyurin, the foreman of Gang 104. For 10 points, name this Russian author of One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich and the Gulag Archipelago. And that is Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Toss-up 34. The character in this novel, referred to Reverend Mother, develops a habit of referring to things as what's-its-name. That character, Nassim, marries the tuberculosis-ridden Adam Aziz years after they had first met through a perforated bedsheet. The main character of this novel was switched at birth with Shiva by the nurse Mary Pariah. After a failed affair with Shiva, Parvati the witch marries the protagonist Salim Sinai, who attributes his telepathy and excellent sense of smell to the fact that he was born on August 15, 1947. For 10 points, name this novel whose title characters were all born within the hour of India's independence by Salman Rushdie. And that is Midnight's Children. Toss-up 35. A character in this play is described as having murder in her eyes after seeing her husband give her son 50 cents. Act 2 of this play begins with some Nigerian music being played by a woman who then shows off her new afro. Lena's husband dies before the start of this play, but over half of his estate is scammed away by Willie. George Murchison and Joseph Asagai court Beneatha in this play, in which Carl Linder tries to get Ruth and Walter not to spend an insurance check on a house in a white neighborhood of Chicago. A line from a Dream Deferred titles, for 10 points, what 1959 play about the Younger Family by Lorraine Hansberry. And that is A Raisin in the Sun. Toss-up 36. In a novel by this author, blue paint that peels off the canvas is used in a painting by Rabo Karabekian. In another of his novels, most people are either part of the army or the Reconstruction and Reclamation Corps, both of which do absolutely nothing. Bluebeard and Piano Player are by this author, who also wrote about false caresses like Hoosiers and the manufactured religion Bokonoism. In his Breakfast of Champions, Kilgore Trout is set free. This author created Ice Nine in Cat's Cradle and wrote about a character who becomes unstuck in time, Billy Pilgrim. For 10 points, name the science fiction writer of Slaughterhouse-Five. And that is Kurt Vonnegut. Toss-up 37. This poem's first part describes a million girls trembling in the sunset and the romance of the streets. Its footnote calls the groaning saxophone the vast lamb of the middle class, and many other things holy. In a section that asks about a sphinx of cement and aluminum that bashed open their skulls and ate up their brains and imagination, this poem repeats the name Moloch. In its third and last part, its speaker tells Carl Solomon, "I'm with you in Rockland." Its opening laments the speaker's starving, hysterical naked friends. The speaker saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness in, for 10 points, what poem by Allen Ginsberg? And that is Howl. Toss-up 38. This poet was inspired by an incident in which Asa Weville pretended to be a man on the telephone to write the line, "The black telephone's off at the root. The voices just can't worm through." A poem by this author lists a cake of soap, a wedding ring, a gold filling, and says, "They had to pick the worms off me like sticky pearls." That poem by this author ends, "Out of the ash I rise with my red hair, and I eat men like air." This poet's description of a man in black with a Mein Kampf look alludes to Ted Hughes, who reordered the poems in her collection, Ariel. For 10 points, name this confessional poet who wrote about Esther Greenwood in The Bell Jar. That is Sylvia Plath. Toss-up number 39. A character in this novel buys a second-hand Studebaker and heads west because Willie the Disc is searching for him. An organization in this novel has ties to Clem and Jody, who sell ergot-infested wheat. In this novel, creatures called mugwumps attend a market where dealers sell giant centipede as black meat. Its narrator promises to deliver Marty Steele before shooting the officers Hauser and O'Brien from the city narcotic squad. Dr. Benway treats this novel's narrator at the reconditioning center in the Freeland Republic, where he is given Eucadol for rehab from his heroin addiction. For 10 points, name this novel about a junkie who travels to Tangier and Interzone, written by William S. Burroughs. And that is Naked Lunch. Toss-up 40. The epilogue of a novel by this author is a New York Times article which notes that a man is now dressed in khaki pants rather than his previous $2,000 custom-tailored English suits. In a novel by this author, Judge Kovitsky throws out a case being covered by the alcoholic journalist Peter Fallow. In this author's first novel, a man who styles himself as Master of the Universe gets caught in a media frenzy after he and his mistress, Maria Ruskin, get into a hit-and-run with the Black Henry Lamb. This author, who used New York City as the setting for a novel about the trial of Sherman McCoy, wrote a book cataloging the psychedelic-fueled adventures of Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters. For 10 points, name this pioneer of new journalism who wrote The Bonfire of the Vanities and The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test. And that is Tom Wolfe, not to be confused with Thomas Wolfe, two different people. This is Tom Wolfe. Toss-up 41. During one episode in this novel, the protagonist remembers Amy's gray eyes in contrast with Mrs. Garner's. One character in this novel is said to have a tree on her back, and earlier some relatives of a schoolteacher stole her milk. Another character in this novel, originally named Joshua, gives his wife to a white man and thus renames himself Stampede. A central location in this novel was once inhabited by Baby Suggs after her departure from Sweet Home to Cincinnati and has the address 124 Bluestone Road. For 10 points, name this novel in which Sethe kills her baby to save it from slavery, a work by Toni Morrison. And that is Beloved. Toss-up 42. One scene in this work sees patrons of Hartman's Cafe berate postmistress Claire for a comment she made to the telegram. One character in this book likes to run over dogs on the road for fun and hangs out with a character who recounts how he got pneumonia due to a nurse at a foster home putting him in a cold tub to cure him of his chronic bedwetting. That latter character had earlier lied about killing a man in Las Vegas. Bobby Rupp is devastated by the central action of this book, from which Iviana and Beverly are partially spared. The central action in this work took place thanks to a tip given by Floyd Wells about a safe kept by the father of Nancy and Kenyon, and it ends with the execution of Dick Hickok and Perry Smith. For 10 points, name this account of the murder of the Clutter family by Truman Capote. And that is In Cold Blood. Toss-up 43. In this novel, Mr. Maslama owns a nightclub which feature wax sculptures of marginalized, dark-skinned figures in history. A character in this novel has an affair with a woman who summited Mount Everest named Alleluia Cone. Another character in this novel is committed to a mental asylum and transforms into an 8-foot-tall goat man. In this novel, pilgrims drown in the Arabian Sea when the waters fail to part as promised by Aisha. The action of this novel begins when a plane explodes over the English Channel. For 10 points, I name this novel in which Jibril Farishta and Saladin Chamcha take on the roles of the Archangel Gabriel and the Devil, written by Salman Rushdie. And that is the Satanic Verses. Toss-up 44. In this novel, the concept of Granfalloon is defined as false cuirass, or linked group of people. Characters in this novel are threatened with the hook if they engage in such practices as touching the soles of their feet against each other. At the beginning of this novel, Dr. Asa Breed meets with the narrator, Jim, in Ilium, New York. The second half of this book is set on San Lorenzo, where Papa Manzano commits suicide using the substance created by Felix Honecker. The irreverent faith Bokonoism appears in this book. For 10 points, name this novel in which Ice Nine destroys the world, written by Kurt Vonnegut. And that is Cat's Cradle. Toss-up 45. In this novel, the protagonist's mother idolized her father, Dr. Foster, to the point of sucking the fingers of his ether-bloated corpse. Another character in this novel was thought to be a witch due to her lack of a navel and carries around the bones of her father. In one episode from this novel, the protagonist meets Circe, an old ex-slave who leads him to his ancestral home of Shalimar, where he learns about his ancestors' supposed ability to fly. The protagonist of this novel is guided by his mother, Pilot, who rejects his father, Macon, and has a showdown with his former friend, Guitar. For 10 points, name this novel by Toni Morrison, titled after a book of the Bible. And that is Song of Solomon. And the last toss-up, 46, I actually wrote this in 2015. So this is my toss-up that I wrote and added. Toss-up 46. In this novel, 3 children are spotted having a mock revival by the Reverend James Moorhead, who then upbraids the youths in a lunch blessing. Another Reverend, Mr. Stone, utters the line of this book's title during a Methodist service, at which Uncle Jack disapproves of a new singing style learned in South Carolina. The main character in this novel thinks she has been impregnated by a French kiss from a boy named Albert from Old Sarum. Zebo's son Frank hits and kills a man coming out of the quarters with a car, and Hester Sinclair regales the main character about race relations in the South at a coffee arranged by Auntie Alexandra. Henry Clinton tries to convince Jean Louise of marriage in, for 10 points, what sequel to To Kill a Mockingbird? And that is Go Set a Watchman. Go Set a Watchman, as it was discovered and released in 2014-15, that I then wrote a toss-up. So, nevertheless, good luck, keep studying, and keep learning. Thanks.